Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, we'll get started. Welcome everybody to this the Governance Risk and Audit Committee for the 13th of June 2023. I welcome you all to it. Small people just coming. I'd like to I'm going to start by thanking the previous committee for the work that they've done that we hope to continue on with. And thank them for the work that they've done. The usual items of admin, fire safety. Hopefully most of you are aware of the fire exits to your left and right, and into the car park if the fire alarm goes off. And I'm not aware of any tests that are due to happen, so it will be for real. Any electronics, because we're all using them nowadays, if we can just make sure they're on silent, please. That would be helpful. And that's where I should check my own, I guess, but I'm sure I did it earlier. Thank you. What I'm going to do, because we've got new members in the committee, before we get started, I'm just going to ask officers that are sat here at the front, if you could just very briefly introduce yourself so that we've got the new members know who we've got here. And then when they've done that, could just say who you are briefly before you talk, so that helps them. So if we could start with that, let's go with the guy. Thank you.
Yeah, Matt Stumbrich. I'm the committee officer for the Governance Risk and Audit Committee.
Thanks, Karen.
Good afternoon. I'm Cara Jordan, the monitoring officer and assistant director for finance, assets and legal.
Good afternoon. I'm Faye Hayward, the head of internal audit.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tina Stankley. I'm the Director of Resources and also the Council Section 151 officer.
The rest I'll leave that if you give input to the meeting, if you could just introduce yourselves then. Thank you. So we have 2 items on the agenda that I need to just bring to your attention briefly. There's an exempt appendix E brackets I, which obviously we can't talk about the detail in there without going to private session. So please, if you can avoid talking about the content of that, we can talk about the general sort of structure, but not any of the specific items. So please be aware of that, and I'll try and remind you when we get there. And if not, I'm sure Cara will. So thank you. And then we're just going to change the substantive items. We'll go through the other parts in a moment, but just to let you know, we're going to bring item 9 in as the first substantive item. So I think that's everything we need to do for now. So received apologies for absence.
Yes, we have apologies from Councillor Emma Spagnola.
Thank you. And any substitutes?
Unfortunately, none were available.
Okay, thank you. Any public questions?
None received.
Okay. Items of urgent business?
Again, none received.
Okay. Declarations of interest, pages 1 to 6 of the agenda. Is there anybody that feel they need to declare any item of interest at this moment in time? No, don't see any. Thank you. So next item is to approve the minutes for the last meeting. Of course, many of us won't have been on that meeting, but fortunately we have 2 that have come back here, Christopher and Saul. So first of all, can I just ask you, have you had a chance to read those minutes, and are they accurate as far as you can say? Because it was a while ago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, they are. I have one question related to the minutes, if I may.
Of
If we go to page number 9, to do with the draft statement of accounts of 2021-2022, they weren't available at the meeting in March, and it states there in the questions and discussions section number 2, I asked whether these would be resolved by June, when this committee next meets next, and I was told yes they would be. So I just wondered if the section 151 would give us an update on that, please.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, good through you, Chair. Yeah, we still haven't got the final version done. We are working with the external auditors to get the 2021 signed off as soon as possible, and we've got a deadline for getting our issues resolved of this Friday, and then the 21-22 will be audited, and we're hoping to have those signed off by I think it's the end of August, and then the 22-23 to be signed off and brought to this committee meeting we thought would be November, but I think so we don't have them available as yet. But as soon as we have a copy, we can send those round to everybody.
Okay, it's obviously new with the committee, seeing the delays that have gone on, and I understand some of them for COVID and pressures. But I would say someone reading this as well, that it feels like we keep moving things down the line and not necessarily dealing with them. So I'd just like to gain some understanding as to how we've got here, because I'm worried about the work programme that is going to get squished up at the end as well. Officer Blacks, thank you.
Address that point or provide further clarity. So for some members who are new to the committee, you'll appreciate that there was a challenge to our 2019-20 accounts, which involved both a police investigation and additional investigation and scrutiny by the council's external auditor. That process wasn't completed until March of 2022. And that means that successive years accounts weren't available or couldn't be audited until that 2019-20 audit process was complete. There is significant backlog of audit work across all four of the principal audit companies, external audit companies that audit local authorities. And Mrs. Hayward may be able to advise further on that in terms of a national context, but it has been reported in local government journals for a number of months and was an issue in terms of the retendering of the public service audit contract that was awarded for the current 4-year term. So there is an issue of capacity external to the authority, but we are a year behind the position that many other authorities find themselves in because of the challenge and additional investigations that were undertaken in respect of the 2019-20 accounts. And Mrs. Stangley has outlined the actions that she's agreed with the external auditor to address that deficit moving forward and catching up, so that by the end of the year we would hope to be in the position of the 20 as outlined.
Okay, so in terms of the catching up, will we get back to where a programme would normally be expected to be, given that I know externally we've got delays as well, but will we be getting back to where we will get a regular rhythm to these reports coming through the committee?
Yes, for through Chair. The ordinary timetable would be for us to have the accounts, the draft set of accounts finished and published by the 31st of May, and then to have them audited after that and present to GRAC, I would say usually the September meeting. And that is the plan, that we should be able to get back to that once we've got 22-23 signed off in November, December, once dependent upon the date of the meeting. And we will then be back to normal. And there's nothing more that the finance team would like than to be back to plan. And the government have moved our date because they did give us some grace with COVID to the 31st of July. It's now back to the 31st of May, and that is what we're already thinking about for next year.
Okay, thank you. Whilst I accept that the delays that have gone on, would it be possible, and I don't want to create extra work, a fairly simple chart that the committee can have that will explain which ones are done and delayed, so that we can see that progress of where we are and how we're going to try and roll that back into a normal programme, so that we can monitor which one's where, because we have to work through the papers at the moment to try and establish what's going on there. So I think that would be helpful. Is there anything else from the committee? No. So okay, so that's the minutes. So if the two of you are happy, I'll sign the minutes as correct. Thank you very much. Right now, it's done and dusted. Thank you. Okay. Next item. Back to me. Trying to be electronic. It's a challenge, but we'll keep going. So the next item will be item 9, won't it? we're going to move on. So bear with me just while I get down there now. Apologies for this. I will get these marked up better in future. Can anybody tell me what page that's on? Sorry, thank you. 75. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. It's not going. Do you know what I want?
You're on the outside.
Yeah, I did that.
To
Thank
outline.
you.
Are you on
Yeah.
the front sheet?
Yeah,
Okay, excellent.
thank you for your patience, everybody.
I can't find something. There it goes.
All right, thanks, man. Appreciate it. And I got my notes back as well. So 9, okay, which is the let's go to the front page of that. It's the agenda item 9, the purchase of additional refuse collection vehicles. So we're working the recommendation that's been put here. I'm just going to read the recommendation that the Cabinet recommend to full council in an addition to the capital programme of £385,000 to purchase 2 new refuse vehicles, refuse collection vehicles, and that the 385 is be added to the residual 65 that is left over from the original budget from vehicles in 2019, and recommend to Cabinet to full council the purchase be funded by borrowing of 335,000 and a revenue contribution of 50,000, and hopefully people have seen in the papers where those are coming from. And the reason is to ensure we can meet customers' expectations. I think it's for this committee to decide what risks are involved with that, both in terms of delivery and financially. So I'm going to open up before I go with any comments. Anybody from the committee has got anything that they wish to raise? Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, the first thing I guess we do need to be clear about what we are looking at here today, because obviously this is going to the overview and scrutiny
Yes.
committee tomorrow, which I'm sure will scrutinise the decision itself.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming today this is being called to this committee to understand the risks around us. And the first risk I'd like to understand is actually why this risk wasn't identified sooner. It states on page 79, collection services have struggled over the last 6 months, and without additional capacity into the fleet, there is a risk that performance will continue to be below acceptable standard. Well, that I think is probably news to this committee, certainly news to me. So I understand why that wasn't articulated 6 months ago and fed into the process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So anybody would like to, anybody that can answer that for us? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Hems, thank you.
Since the introduction of the target operating model, which members will be aware happened in September of last year, there have been some issues in terms of performance that have been exacerbated by other factors, such as an ongoing pay dispute between Serco and its employees. But it is become apparent that the success that as an authority we've had in terms of our garden bin subscriptions, so for the garden waste service and for trade waste, so the commercial waste offering that we have, also generated an additional burden in terms of the number of collections that are undertaken. So because that is an ongoing position in terms of growth in those service areas, and we have no real advanced knowledge of how quickly or how significantly those services will impact. On top of the TOM, it has created a bit of a tipping point. So in terms of the round changes, etc., it's created a bit of tipping point. So Serco identified it earlier in the year. We have been in negotiations with Serco to understand whether that is what's required in terms of whether it's an obligation on the council or whether it's down to other factors. I think in terms of the issue around why it's come about now, it's been the culmination of discussions between ourselves and Serco for a period of time, and it just we have reached the end of those discussions with them, and this is the position that is the outcome of those discussions effectively, which is why it's now here now and hadn't been identified necessarily at the beginning of the process.
So just for a bit more clarity for me, so because we've got some figures here where it's been growth in income, £700 or £700,000 across the two. But are you saying that we couldn't clearly identify the need for those vehicles until they've made these changes and resolved the industrial issues? Is that what we're saying?
Not so much the industrial action issues that has caused some degree of delay in the process of identifying rather than being the cause of it. But ultimately, I think it's fair to say that when you're running a contract, there are certain tolerances within that contract. They as a commercial operator, Serco will run that on a lean basis. They will run it effectively and they will make adjustments as they go along in order to make sure they sweat the assets and deliver as efficient a service as possible. The growth in our customer numbers, I think, reaches a point where they are unable to sweat those assets any further in an effective manner. And so they have, at that point, they have provided additional facilities. They are currently providing an additional vehicle. That is not a sustainable position under the contract. But ultimately, it reaches a point where they will come and approach and say, we now can do no more within our current resource. We need additional resource to be able to deliver that. I think you would anticipate as members that as officers that we will do all that we can to make sure that that's the position, and that Serco, and I think it's fair to say the position around the contract, around the target operating model and some of the difficulties that have been experienced in terms of the delivery of that over a prolonged period of time, that have then been compounded by the industrial action and the impacts that have muddied the water in terms of whether that it's made it slightly more difficult to get to the bottom of exactly where they are in terms of, is it an efficient model? Is it actually at that position? And that's taken some time to reach that position.
Okay.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Officer Hems. What I'm hearing there, though, is that there were challenges at the start of the year, and obviously that sounded like there was a risk there. We're now at the stage, this is actually no longer a risk. It's a risk that actually has happened, materialised, and now the council has to find £450,000 worth of budget, which we didn't include in the budget, which we passed only, 2 or 3 months ago. My concern is there was a risk there that wasn't identified. So should we have, knowing what you know, should we actually identified that sooner and articulated and raised that, so we could have all been forewarned that there might be sort of more demand on the budget?
I suppose, in hindsight, the answer is we could have raised it as a risk at that stage. I think equally it's a question of likelihood, isn't it? At that stage, in terms of risk, there are a multitude of things that are potential risks every day, but I wouldn't necessarily bring them before the committee and say, here are the risks. Otherwise, you would, it is a question of making a decision about whether it is a reasonable, feasible risk. At the time that we were looking at this, it was a possible, it was a possibility, but it hadn't actually necessarily materialized into the position we have today. And ultimately, the position is one of choice for the authority, because actually there are a number of options within the paper that are set out, that you are able to, that full council is able to take. But I accept that in terms of this, budget wise, we could have come forward and said there is a possibility that you will need some further funding. But basically we didn't know that was going to be the case. And from my perspective, I in negotiations terms, I'm not sure it's a position I would want to show my cards to a contractor and say we've got the budget at a stage where we're in discussions and negotiations with them.
Okay. Just going with that and identifying that risk. I will come to you next. Okay. We've obviously seen this increase going on, and we've not got a graph to show whether that increase has been recently, in terms of income. So whether any consideration was given internally to hedge against that by ring fencing some of that extra income towards that possibility. I'm just wondering whether, again, having seen that there's a risk, but you don't want to declare it, but we could have potentially, just as a learning, put some of that aside, because we could have potentially had half the money that we're looking for. I don't know where that money goes. It doesn't stay with Serco, does it? It goes presumably back to us.
No, the income from charged for services comes to us as an authority.
Yeah.
I don't know, Officer Stankley, whether it's appropriate for you to explain what happens to that when it comes in.
I mean, we could look at this as an investment in the service rather than the need to spend money, because as hopefully everyone appreciates, it is a step change. There comes a point at which you can't physically collect any more waste with the number of vehicles you've got. And so you have to take that decision to purchase another vehicle, which, yes, you have the capital outlay, but you then hope to recoup that through the additional bin collections that you take and the income that you get from that. And it will be that the cost of borrowing will be covered by that additional income. We do have, which we've applied, this non-performance compensatory payment that we get, and that is being used to purchase the vehicle. I mean, we could look at going forwards, setting up a provision whereby we set something aside out of that each year, so that when it comes to renewing the next lot of vehicles, it's either worn out or because of increased service uptake again, we have more set aside for that.
Yeah, I think it was, I understand that part where we're going forward. It's whether we could have identified that risk and mitigated against it with the money we've already collected. That was, I was trying to understand if we've identified a risk, potentially, we can see an increase in income that we've done nothing. I'm not saying we've done nothing, that's too harsh. No, but we considered whether we could have kept some of that just for the learning process where we could have identified the risk. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm being clear enough. Thank you.
I mean, by actually contributing to the level of general reserves, it is effectively there.
Right.
In terms of, it's making that decision, and we're not actually drawing from reserves to cover the cost of this, because the additional income will cover the cost of borrowing, and we've already got the compensatory payment that we're using. But it is just going into the general reserve really, rather than being set aside.
Okay.
So we have in previous years generated extra income which is sitting there to be used for service provision.
Okay, all right, thank you. So sorry to keep you waiting.
Thanks, John. Just to really just expand on that risk, it says 7.1 on page 79. Collections have struggled over the last 6 months, and without this additional capacity, there's a risk that performance will continue to be below an acceptable standard. So we're kind of sort of assuming there that it is already below an acceptable standard. So, and obviously that's a performance risk, it's a reputational risk to the council. So my question would be, how long is the build time for these vehicles? Because that risk continues. It says in the next 7.2 that Serco could build these more quickly than 15 months, which is the sort of standard build time for them. But even if it was 6 months, we've still got 6 months of
performance risk and reputational risk because collections aren't at an acceptable standard. So how will we mitigate that 6 months or whatever time it will be to ensure that the time between now and when those vehicles are ready, we are doing all we can to make sure that the risks are minimized and we're mitigating them. Thank you.
So I'll split my answer into two. So in terms of garden waste collection service, Serco are providing an additional vehicle at their own cost at the current time. That is not sustainable for them, obviously, for obvious reasons, and in effect isn't what the contract says over the provision of plant and machinery. So there is an approach within the contract which basically said that the local authority will provide, will pay for, will fund and own the plant and vehicles associated with the delivery of the contract. That was a decision made to mitigate risk on the basis that, well, two reasons: financial risk, because we could borrow at a lower rate than the contractor would have been able to, whoever the contractor had been when the contract was let, and therefore financially it made, or it reduced our risk. The other element of risk is that if a contractor then went into administration, that those vehicles would be ours, as opposed to being owned by a liquidator or an administrator or a hire company. And if a large contractor did, fold, clearly it wouldn't just be North Norfolk, or in fact in this contract, North Norfolk, Breckland and Kings Lynn, it would be a number of people who'd suddenly be scrabbling for vehicles. So by procuring the vehicles ourselves, it protected the contract and us from that. So the contract is written so that it basically the authority is responsible for providing plant. Contractor will expect that to be the position going forward quite reasonably, although they didn't put into their contract bid for additional vehicles to be provided throughout the life of the contract. So from that perspective, there is continued provision. They are out there collecting those bins. So the garden waste is less of an issue. For trade waste, this is twofold really. The first is that at the current time, there are a lot of trade waste collections. So those that are, they tend to be the customers that are holiday homes, holiday lets, etc., where they receive a collection that would be in sync with a normal residential property, who are serviced by 240 litre bins. And there is a significant efficiency to be able to collect those bins on a fortnightly basis with the normal collection rounds. And that has been the approach that's been taken. That increase in customers that we've seen into that sort of category is placing a strain upon the normal collection rounds. But this additional vehicle allows two things. It allows some of that pressure to be taken off the domestic rounds where we are seeing performance that I consider not to be acceptable. And what I'm talking is bins that are being collected on the scheduled day of collection. And also it will allow us as an authority to look at growing our trade waste offering to customers within North Norfolk, so that it allows growth of a chargeable service. So from that perspective, that is, there is no immediate impact on the vehicles not arriving tomorrow. And in terms of the procurement, effectively Serco have, as a large contractor, are able to negotiate build slots. So they will have booked for potential contracts that they're bidding for, build slots for those for delivery of vehicles. They have provided some of those build slots for these vehicles, which is, if we were to go out and just procure ourselves, we would be talking about a significant length of time. At the moment, their build slots they're looking at for November currently. So it is an improved position than if we were to do it independently.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That makes sense. Can I just follow up? So are we saying that there will be some aspects of the service being unacceptable, in your opinion, until we get the new vehicles?
No, it's not what I'm saying. I work, and so do the other officers on this contract, work on a regular basis with Serco to bring about improvements. We are putting significant pressure upon Serco to generate performance. And to that effect, at the moment, they are providing additional support rounds. So from my perspective, they will continue to do, or I'm expecting them to continue to do that for a period of time. But we have to balance that as an authority against the issues of things like, if they're putting out additional support rounds, then that will generate additional fuel use, which will generate additional carbon production. So for me, we have to do this in a manner that is sustainable. And I think, there is a balance to be had here. But equally, I'm mindful of the fact that, at the moment, Serco are in a position where they are doing this whilst we resolve this issue. It's been part of a wider commercial discussion with Serco, as you would expect, between us and the other authorities on an ongoing basis. And so from that perspective, this almost closes a loop in terms of those commercial matters discussions, such that it enables us to move forward. But I think if we don't close that loop, Serco will then reevaluate and say, let's revert to contract. Let's go back to a contractual discussion with you about what your obligations are under the contract.
Thank you. Talking about sustainability, but in terms of sustaining the contract and the service, I see right early on in the report it says customer growth over the last few years and then combined are budgeted to generate an income for the authority of around £3 million in 23-24. Do we know, that's at 1.1, do we know what those figures are based on? How have we just I'm not sure how many customers potentially there are commercial that we can grab that would generate that amount when you consider it's been 500,000 over the last few years. So I was trying to understand that growth to support the payments. It's about the risk of, can we continue to pay? So we need to make sure that it does generate that income. I don't know if
so in terms of trade customers, we have continued to grow, other than in the year of COVID 2021, where understandably a number of businesses did not trade because government precluded them from doing so, and therefore we provided flexibility to not have a trade waste service at that time. We have seen a growth in our trade income across each year. And so from a trade perspective, there are, we are anticipating further growth. And I think one of the reasons we are looking at that is because we have required Serco, I say we as in terms of the single contract across the three authorities, have required Serco to honour their bid submission in providing a commercial manager. So they have just recruited into that. Part of that person's role will be to look at growing commercial waste for the three sales for the three authorities. Clearly, if we grow commercials, there's little point in having someone growing our commercial base if we don't have the ability to service it, because if we can't service it, people will vote with their feet and go elsewhere. We also, and I think part of that is that we know there are other contractors that operate within the North Norfolk area. So there are a number of other providers, large national companies who have rounds that are within North Norfolk. my aspiration is to be the provider of choice for our businesses within North Norfolk, because we can offer a more flexible service. You know, we're not a service that only operates on the routes that are convenient for us. We don't operate only on the days that we happen to be driving past the business. We have flexibility over our ability to offer a service, both in terms of, you know, day of the week, but also across, you know, businesses that get busy across the summer than they are in the winter. We will change and adapt our provision to enable those businesses to operate within our district effectively. So from my perspective, there is a lot of growth out there that we can attract and we can target, but we can only do that if we have the capacity on our vehicles to be able to collect those. And if the other alternative is we offer that service and we grow, but we put it onto the domestic rounds, which are already quite stretched, and therefore that has a detrimental impact on the domestic collections further.
Yeah, I understand those bits about the service and the level of service. In a way, that's for OVM scrutiny tomorrow. My concern is that we're saying that the authority. Can I try it another way? Perhaps Sustainability can help. What over the life? What are we looking at? We're just looking at the 335 effectively, isn't it, to repay? So, although it says 3 million here, are we confident that we can raise through this extra vehicle the 335 for it to pay for itself? That's what we need to know, isn't it? I think that we're going to buy this vehicle, we're going to pay it back. Will it generate that income? Because this 3 million is just, it's a number that we've not seen necessarily evidence for. So are we confident that it will generate that level of income over the lifetime of the vehicle?
So
yeah, thank you.
Just in terms of income figures, the budgeted figures for 23-24 for garden services are £1,327,250, and for trade £1,665,000. So those are clearly, that's not all income that comes directly to us,
right?
But there is, once we have paid for the disposal costs and for Serco's collection costs, you know, there is an element of that which is returned to the authority.
Yeah.
That clearly, in terms of the, you know, if we were to grow that, we'd have a higher proportion of income coming to, or a larger amount of income, proportion would stay the same, but a larger amount of income would be coming to us. I think in terms of the amount that we would look at being returned, you wouldn't get it all back in year one necessarily, but across the remaining life of the contract, most certainly you would retain that, you would return that amount of money based on the fact that the current vehicle provision that we have, you know, the current number of customers pays for the other 3 vehicles.
Okay.
Or the other vehicles on the fleet associated with that service.
Okay, so I think in terms of the report, it might have helped us to understand that this is what we receive, this is how much we get back, so that we could see that accepting it will grow. Because that was the thing that was missing, certainly for me. I don't know for other members of the committee, but that was what was missing for me, was to see that, to be sure, because we're just looking after that risk side of it, to be sure that there is the money potentially coming in with reasonable assurance that we will get the increase to pay that. I think that for me, and I welcome input from anybody else. For me, the principle of it and the funding of it and the idea looks fine. We need to just be evidential in that we're comfortable that that by spending this money, it will get paid back, and indeed we need it to pay back more as an authority. So they were the gaps in the information that we had. So which I think has been cleared in there. You know, obviously, Steve, thank you. You've cleared some of that up in that. So
I think if we were to produce figures in the way, in terms of the way you are suggesting, they would have to look to go into purple papers. Because
possibly,
clearly I would not want to
of course,
make public to any potential contractor now or in the future what our income associated with a service was, nor for that matter to our competitors, especially in the trade waste side of things.
no, I accept that. It just would have been helpful, I think, for us at this stage, and I know it's come short notice, but to have had that information, even as you say in purple papers, that said we currently get this, and it leaves us this, amount comes into the authority, and we can get some idea. So I don't know. Is there anybody else, anything they wish to add or ask? Councillor Brown, thank you. If it, just briefly, so that I'm sure people will know you, but if you could just very briefly introduce yourself, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak as an observer. And may I be among the first to congratulate you on your appointment to the chair of this committee. My name's Andrew Brown, Councillor Andrew Brown. I'm the portfolio holder for planning and enforcement. I attended the cabinet meeting on the 5th of June and was concerned that there was perhaps a shortfall in detail on how this is going to wipe its face financially, which of course it needs to, because we're borrowing from reserves internally. That wasn't entirely clear on the papers when I read them at cabinet. There was a discussion about whether there was a risk. There was a difference of opinion on that, and that's why it's on the agenda today. So we're borrowing public money. It's not the council's money, it's public money from the reserve. So we need to know how timely, how quickly, what the regime is for paying that back. I've just heard you raise that, and what I've heard in reply is encouraging. But we need to be absolutely certain, because what we didn't know at the cabinet meeting was the additional income that would be generated by acquiring two new vehicles and maintaining the service that we are providing for our customers. And in a sense, we're a victim of our own success. Obviously, trade customers who want more garden bins are attracted by the fact that our rates are competitive, and they're attractive. Otherwise, we wouldn't be expanding our business at the rate that we are. So that said, I just needed further detail to understand how soon and what the implications were if we didn't continue to expand at the rate that we have been, with the exception of 2021, for the reasons stated. And what I hear today is encouraging. I'd still think that if this detail had been provided in purple pages to cabinet, we'd have even a better idea than we have even currently today. I've got to say that, I'm afraid. The other thing that I wanted to ask was, converting a vehicle, if we obtain it to HVO fuel, is that permitted under the current contract with Serco? We're not barred out from doing that, or would we need to take the service back at the end of the contract to be able to achieve that? And the reason why I ask that is that we're aiming for net zero in 2030, and it's quite important that we make a move in that direction with these vehicles as soon as we can. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to take up too much time. I do support the Chief Financial Officer's suggestion that we create a contingency fund year on year, so that we do have a float, in inverted commas, moving forward to purchase additional vehicles if we find ourselves in a similar situation to the one that we're in now a couple of years down the line.
Sorry, HVOs, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in effect, HVO is just a different fuel. So I'm currently in discussions with Serco. As you'll remember, Councillor Nigel Lloyd was a great exponent of running the fleet. There were some issues previously, one about supply, down to the conflict, the war in Ukraine, and then about the alternative supply routes or supply product that was available, and its sustainability from an ecological point of view rather than its carbon point of view. That is something that's ongoing, and I will bring back in at a future point. However, there is no impediment. It would be like you putting, instead of petrol, putting super petrol in your car for one cycle or for as many cycles. It's the same type of product in terms of its use. It just happens to come from a different source. One is, obviously one's from fossil fuels, the other is from a sustainable source, and that's why the carbon impact of HVO is different.
So I think there was the question of ring fencing, which I think the fields stand, Tina, whether that was something that could be done in the future.
Yes, we could do that, and we'd set an appropriate level so that we could look at the need for replacement on an ongoing basis, and set aside enough to fund the purchase of vehicles on an ongoing basis.
Okay.
It would have to be subject to, I suppose, a certain level of income being achieved each year and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Chairman, I don't know if the committee wants to make a recommendation on that basis, if everyone's supportive.
Can I, just before you reach that point, so again, we are talking about vehicles that are there for provision for additional services, so paid for services where we as an authority effectively have an obligation, because we as an authority have grown the service significantly. For clarity, the contract places responsibility on Serco to provide or to specify and warrant what plant was required to deliver the contract, and they have done that in respect of all the other service areas that they have. What I don't want to do is create any impression for members or for Serco that what we are doing is setting aside amount of money to replace fleet that they may have a responsibility for.
Okay.
And I don't see that we would necessarily, I hope I'm wrong, and I would love to be able to say, let's put a load of money to one side to buy another trade waste vehicle in X number of years' time. But there is a lot of growth in the service to achieve before we would get to that point. So I guess my question is, I guess, is this the right forum to be making a recommendation to do something until we understand what the likelihood is of achieving or needing to achieve that in the future? So if you make a recommendation that should happen and the growth in the system is beyond the life of the contract when we would need that, then you're going to be setting aside a load of money that you might never need to spend, and then you're never going to be able to touch it. So I think I understand the sentiment, but I think there is more work to be done before we actually there is a decision to be made on that, to understand the impact of this new commercial manager post and our ability to grow very significantly beyond the capacity of that trade vehicle.
Okay, thank you. So is there a mechanism in place, or do we need to establish a mechanism that would monitor that so that we could make that decision at a later time, that we could be alerted so that we know it's growing, we know it's going to happen? We need not necessarily ring fencing, that we need to be alerted as a council that it's going to be required in budgets. Is there a mechanism, or can we develop a mechanism to deliver that for us?
The waste contract is a very complicated element.
Yeah.
The North Norfolk part of the waste contract is probably the most complex contract. You know, it's certainly probably the most complex in Serco's portfolio, and I would suggest it's probably more complicated than a significant proportion of those across the country. In terms of, you know, how those elements hang together, I think if you put a mechanism in place that said, when we reach this or when we do that, you know, there will be an opportunity for another vehicle, you remove officers' ability to manage that contract with the contractor in a way that is advantageous for this authority. And I, you know, I don't want to sound defensive.
No, that's fine.
But ultimately, I spend a lot of time and effort in order to try and address the, you know, the aspects of this contract that are effectively a tactical, strategic, operational basis. And so I think it would be, it would inhibit the ability of officers to have conversations with the contractor and equally with our fellow authorities across the contract in order to develop the best outcomes for the taxpayer and for this authority associated with those things. You know, I apologize, this has come forward out of line with the budget process, but unfortunately, in terms of contract operation, you know, it hasn't fallen in sync with that. It is just, you know, there has been a lot of work into it being put into doing it. I have very much, and I will pass on to the officers involved in the delivery of the contract, taken on board the comments made about identifying risk early and about bringing risk forward. But the delivery of the contract element, you know, is one that is, you know, we are constantly monitoring and constantly having conversations with with our colleague authorities and with Serco in order to address those. And I think, you know, we could look at developing aspects that would come forward on this basis of additional vehicles, but I'm not sure how that would, if I'm entirely honest, I'm not sure how a mechanism would work to do so because of the complexity of the delivery of services.
Yeah, no, I get that. And please, you know, officers, I know officers work hard. You know, there's no.
I'm trying not to sound defensive because I'm just trying to convey the complexity of, you know, so that if it was just a domestic service that we were operating for household or even just the garden waste service, you know, they are slightly more, you know, slightly easier. But it's when you start to introduce trade customers and the balance of rounds and elements like that. I mean, Serco, you know, we incentivize Serco to try and operate this, or it's to a Serco's advantage rather, to try and operate this contract in as efficient manner as possible.
Okay.
And that's what we have to try and derive for them, to say to them, you're the big operator. You're the big company, you know how to do this, go off and do it. Unfortunately, they tend to come back and say, we've discovered a problem in terms of our capacity, etc. Can you help us with this? And I simplify that massively, but that is the conversation that's been had.
All I was aiming for from this was to, where we spoke earlier from Councillor Cushion, that we perhaps could have identified it earlier. All I'm asking is that we make sure when I say mechanism, I don't mean any grand thing, that if we see that trend happening again, that we get, if you like, an early alert, also understanding what you said about the commercial aspects we would not want to make. So I understand that.
I think in that respect, the point is taken by me, and I will make sure officers are fully aware of that.
Okay, and so I'll come to Councillor Shires in just a moment. Thank you. Does that satisfy the committee? Any comments to that? No. Okay, thank you. Councillor Shires, if I could ask you again to introduce yourself. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you and congratulations, Mr. Chair. Lucy Shires, councillor with responsibility for all the glamorous things, finance, estates, property services. First of all, I just want to take your apology, Officer Hems, for not organising our customers across the district so that they do fall within a decent time for us to set the budget. That apology is not necessary. We are a very flexible authority, so anybody can join our services at any time, and they don't all do that in August. Otherwise, it would have been better for our budget setting. So please retract your apology on that. That wasn't necessary. I think what we're dealing with here greatly is the risk that comes with success. And we are very lucky to have had great success over the two services that we're talking about. Councillor Cushing will be aware that during the Cabinet meeting on the 5th of June, I myself threw an array of questions at officers and portfolio holders sat to my right regarding this paper, primarily because the financial risk to us as an authority was my immediate concern. But I am massively content that this committee have understood the financial risk through their questioning. So I am content that this committee has done exactly what it needed to do in that respect. Just a point of clarity, if I may, for information purposes. When we met at Cabinet, we talked about borrowing in year 25-26. Is that with the lead time that we would have had as a local authority, which was the 12 to 15 months? I know that Serco get a preferential time on, obviously they've got a preferential slot for builds. Does that mean that the borrowing may fall in the next financial year rather than the financial year after that? It's just a point of information because we were given information at the last Cabinet.
Thank you.
Yes, I could. Yeah, I misunderstood in the report. It says 12 to 15 months, which is why I said 25-26. So I would correct that now to 24-25 because the vehicle would be made available to us in 23-24. So that was my misunderstanding because I thought it was 12 to 15 months before we would get the vehicle. But it's always the borrowing would start the repayments the year after the asset's acquired.
Sorry, Councillor Ring, did you want to say something?
I could, yeah,
Yeah,
thank you
no,
very
no,
much.
you
Yeah,
wanted- you were indicating,
Callum
but
Ringer,
if
I'm
you
the
could-
portfolio holder for IT, environmental and waste services, and a new councillor, so well and truly getting up to speed with what Officer Hems has described as quite a complex portfolio. I was just going to touch on a couple of things about risk and about success. Perhaps the greatest risk lies in not making a decision and in not purchasing these additional vehicles. The figures over the last 5 or 6 years, which I've seen in terms of the growth in numbers of customers, is encouraging and can, with the exception of the year of COVID, is continual. It's a sign of economic growth in the area as well, which I think is worth remarking on. The continual growth in trade waste in particular. And other than that, I was just going to thank the committee for their comments today and the officers for their help and support to me in getting up to speed.
Thank you for that. So, 2 things just to cover off then. Are we happy not to go forward with the additional vehicle recommendation? We're happy to leave that as it is, and we're happy with the answer we've given. Thank you. So I guess it just remains for us to agree with the recommendation. Is that correct? No? So
Yeah, you're commending the report to council essentially.
yeah. So and are we happy to do that? Are we happy that it lays things out as it is, that we've declared it in the committee, that the minutes are available to people? Okay, thank you. So yes, so is that just a no? Is it not?
If you are kind of recommending that council approve the recommendation as stated in the report, if you could have propose a seconder and take a vote on that.
Okay, well, I'm happy to propose it. Do I have a seconder? Boyle. And all in favour? We all? Yep, absolutely.
I thought we're just assessing the risk here today, so we're not actually, this committee's not, it should be the overview and scrutiny committee that actually reviews the decision that was being made by the cabinet.
Yeah.
Not this committee, as far as I'm, unless,
But
monitoring officer explains otherwise. I just thought we were here to assess whether the risk aspect of this.
I think you are.
Thank you.
I think
About
you
what
are.
we're actually,
I think you are assessing the risk factors in regards to the purchase of the waste vehicles. However, I think it is appropriate from GRAC's point of view to propose second and vote. That doesn't take away from overview and scrutiny, properly considering the matter as well.
So we're saying we've looked at the risk, and in terms of risk, we're happy for this to go forward. Is that correct, Carla? Yes. Yeah. So that's and we're proposing as a committee to do that. So yeah.
John, could I just give it, absolutely, yeah, that's fine, but could we just make those amendments? It wasn't a 12 to 15 month build time, it's likely to be 6 months, and that's November, and then that point about that then being the next financial year that the
Before it goes.
borrowing would.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anything else? All right, so we've got a proposal and a second then. All in favour? All good. All right, thank you. It's unanimous. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody. It was a bit of a slog for a first one, but thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so back to item 7 on the agenda. Are you still with us, Faye?
I am, Chair, thank you.
Okay, so
Thank you so much,
Yep.
Chair. Okay, so on to agenda item 7, and it's the first of 2 reports for you today from me. This first one is the internal audit progress and follow-up report. So if I take you straight to the juicy bits, which is page 60, we go over the reason why this report has been pulled together. It talks about the public sector internal audit standards and my responsibilities as the Chief Audit Executive and Head of Internal Audit. We also provide a bit of information itself about the gradings that we've got there. So the substantial assurance, reasonable, limited, and no assurance, and that gives you an idea of what we mean when we provide this grading term on each of our reports. So sorry, page 18 rather than page 60. I jumped ahead a little there. At section 2.1, you'll see that the plan was originally approved in March 2022, and the 3 reports listed there have been deferred until 23-24. Reasoning has been given to the previous committee. If you had any queries about that, let me know. And then at section 3, we talk about progress made in delivering the agreed audit work. And this is the last progress report for the year, and we have been able to deliver 158 days, which is the 100% of the revised programme of work for the year ahead. On to section 4.4, you'll see there listed the reports that we've been able to finalise within this period for the year-end progress report. And we give an indication of the recommendations that have been raised within each and what grading they've been given. As you can see there, all of them are positive, but from the last one on the list there, which is key controls and assurance, which was given a limited assurance grading. We'll delve into that a little bit more deeper later on in the report. However, I just did want to point out that we've carried out 2 advisory pieces of work as well this year. 2 position statements, and the first was issued for economic growth. No improved suggested improvement points were raised for that review, and we've given a little bit of an overview about what the findings were in that area for your viewing. And then the second was property services operational. So we concluded the position statement with 22 suggested improvements. And I have suggested that we carry out a follow-up review on this area for next year's programme, just to satisfy ourselves that health and safety concerns around managing health and safety maintenance have been rectified. All of the recommendations that have been raised have been accepted by management, and at that point when we come in Q4 next year, we'll be able to give you more of an update about how those have been delivered. Section 5 is follow-up. So later on in the report, you'll be provided with appendices that show any recommendations that are currently outstanding. They've been given a new time frame, and they've also been provided. We've also had a comment provided for each that tells you what progress looks like at this stage. So if we move on to those, at Appendix 1, you'll see the progress in full. That's the whole plan that we've delivered, along with the assurance levels and the recommendations raised, and the date of the committee that the report was presented. That's page 22. Moving on to Appendix 2, you've got a very long list of reports that we've finalised there. You've got the dashboard that tells you the overall grading and the key strategic findings. So it's there that you'll be able to see the main comments that we've made about that area under review and the number of action points raised under the relevant gradings. So if we head over to the one that received the limited assurance grading, you'll see that starting page 47 there, that was a limited assurance. Now, all of the action points raised here have been accepted by the finance team and suitable deadlines added to those. We'll continue to monitor those through to completion. I think the key strategic findings does summarise it very well. Key reconciliations haven't been done in a timely way in accordance with the processes on this occasion. We found examples of investments needing to be independently signed off by another officer to help with segregation of duties. We had a concern around car parking income not being reconciled, and the fixed asset register had some additions and disposals added to it, but I think it's acknowledged that there's still work in that area for the accounts. So that's a very high level overview there. And as I say, the team have committed to working on all of those points going forward. If we're in a situation where we don't have completion, they'll come back before the committee with an explanation. So on page 50, we've got the status of agreed internal audit recommendations for all of the audit reports that we've raised. And then page 51 onwards, you'll see, as I described, the latest situation with any that are outstanding that are of urgent or important priority. So they're the key risks that are open at the moment that internal audit has raised. And a response has been provided for all of those, which is incredibly encouraging. When we do ask for an update, those come back. But you may have some questions that I can try and direct to officers or get a response for if any more detail is needed. I'll hand over to you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I go to, thank you for that, Faye. Go to page 47, where you've got limited assurance. The first one you've got down there, the council has struggled to perform core financial reconciliations since the introduction of the new finance system in December 2022. Go to page 27. It also makes reference to, I believe, reconciliations not being done since the introduction of the, I think it's Civica cash book. I wonder if Officer Stankley could give us more information about the system that obviously doesn't seem to be working as it should do. Is that the case?
It's not a case of the system not working. It is a case of officers learning how to use the system, and that it is taking a lot more time to work through the reconciliations, and also the team is currently under-resourced at the minute. We've got some vacancies in the team, so work is taking place that is a priority. The reconciliations were all up to date before the system was transferred over to the new system, and they're sort of working on what they consider to be priority works at the moment in terms of, you know, working with the system, getting budget monitoring reports out, and we have got that down as a priority as one of the first things that we will address. We've currently gone through a process of, or we're going through a process of recruitment. I've interviewed today, and hopefully we'll be able to appoint a technical accountant, and then we will follow through with an accountancy assistant and a chief technical accountant, and we'll be able to catch up as soon as possible once they're on board, and we have that extra capacity. Because they were all okay prior to the system coming in, we're looking at things like our bank income. That's all, you know, sort of certain elements of it we are checking and are happy with. It's just the actual reconciliations haven't been carried out due to capacity, really, is what it comes down to.
Was it anticipated then that there'd be that the staff would struggle to do the reconciliations post the implementation of the system?
No, it wasn't anticipated that there would be the additional work required. We had an old system before, and we anticipated that it would take less time, or the same amount of time, but it's actually taking more time to work through things.
So if I may, were staff able to use the new system prior to its implementation to be trained on it? So I'm just wondering how we might have gleaned that information that people would struggle afterwards.
No, there weren't. The training's been carried out since implementation.
Right, because normally you put a new system live, you train people. No, you people in order to test it, and you train it beforehand. And obviously, one would assume part of that testing would be to do reconciliations to make sure A, that the IT itself worked, but also people could actually use it.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah,
The system hasn't been implemented in the way that I probably would have implemented it, in terms of a long lead-in time and the testing that should be carried out beforehand, using a test system before touching a live system, all the various bits and pieces that you'd carry out in implementing the system. But I think officers that were involved in the implementation are no longer with us, and we are where we are. So we just need to move forwards in terms of getting up to speed on reconciliations, because we can't change what has happened in the past. And I'm confident that once we've got that extra resource in, we'll be back up to speed in all areas. And this is what happens, you know, when you are under-resourced. The evidence of that under-resource is coming through now in terms of the limited assurances and the key controls, the statement of accounts being behind. You know, part of that is due to the capacity, and other pieces of work that are being delayed. But we are looking to address that and getting back to normal.
If I sorry, I may.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I guess what I'm getting is obviously, I mean, obviously you said you weren't part of the decision to put it live in the first place, which is fine, but obviously we put something in there which should have helped, and that all it's done, it's by the sounds of it, is actually added to the burden of your team, not helped ease it. And I'm just wondering what the necessity was to put a system live then. The other thing I'd say in more generic terms is you're putting a finance system live at the end of the year, which is just prior to the financial end of the year working as well, which obviously heightens the risk as opposed to putting a new system live in, say, in the summer, when you've obviously got longer time to pour it actually affects your end of years issues, no end of year reporting.
I think if I'm reading this right, this is all inherited by you, decisions made before your time. Is that yeah. So okay, thank you.
Yes. Again, the decision to implement then, and that was the decision chosen. The date was chosen to implement at that point in time, and then arrangements are made for things like switching off access to the old system, in terms of being able to input into the old system. It's just when the decision was made, and I'm not sure why. I mean, ideally you would implement a new system on the 1st of April or halfway through the year, so that you know where you are with things. I'm not sure why the decision was taken, but again, we can't alter what has happened. We've just got to look at moving forwards and sort of catching up, really.
So I think just if that's okay, thank you, Christopher. I think we just need to be happy at this stage that we've heard there's been recruitment interviews today, that we're putting things in place, that whilst that is a learning point, which I think clearly has been seen, that we're comfortable that the process is being done to bring it back on track. Does that fit with
yes,
your,
I mean,
with your
it's
argument?
actually the corporate learning in terms of actually when you put systems live, whether it be a finance system or anything else that you're doing at a time of year, if it doesn't work as you should expect, you've got time to recover. But also I would suggest and hope that there is adequate testing which involves user training to make sure you tease those things out beforehand. Can I just ask, do you say that you've got, when you get resource in, do you have a plan to get resource in, and do we know when we can expect reconciliations to be up to date? Are you working towards a date?
Yes, in terms of getting resource in, as I say, we've interviewed today and hopefully we'll be able to appoint. If we are, then we will look to recruit an accountancy assistant, and I would get the advert out Thursday, Friday this week. It's been through job evaluation. The chief technical accountant has been through job evaluation on Monday, and it's come out of the grade that I would have expected, i.e. no change to what it was previously. And again, that one will go out to advert either this week alongside the accountancy assistant or next week, as soon as I get round to that. And depending upon the notice periods, I'd expect technical accountant perhaps to be able to start quite quickly. The accountancy assistant within a month, and then perhaps the chief technical accountant, we may have to wait 2 or 3 months. But the extra resource will be in for that team in terms of technical accountant and accounting assistant. And then we've also got to look at recruiting somebody additional, some extra hours that we have not filled for a while in the exchequer team. And we've got to yet just look at what we want there, and then we'll go out to recruit.
May I just add, just in terms of the comments around the finance system, for the benefit of members that weren't here in the March meeting, we have got an item on the audit plan to look at a post-implementation review. So some of that learning, we'll have a good conversation with Tina and team and try to get into that and make some recommendations for the future.
That's helpful. Thank you. Fine. Okay, happy, good. Can I just pick up, I don't think there's anybody else indicated now. Can I just pick up on in Appendix 4? That we've got quite a few items here that have been outstanding for a while and revised several times. I think it would be good for this committee to have some sort of review and understanding to see how long these are going to keep. It just feels, again, if we just take the first one because it's the first on the list, not for any other reason, that it's been going on for what, 3.5 years, possibly 4, because it's waiting for a planning service improvement plan. It's been revised 7 times. It just feels that we're not actually tackling some of these things, and so I would like to see have some thoughts and advice on how we could actually tackle these things so that we can start shortening them. So I don't know if there's anybody that can give us some advice on that. Steve, Officer Platts, thank you.
Thank you. So prior to COVID, I think this list was running at around 45 outstanding audit recommendations. So there has been considerable progress made, and I think Mrs. Hayward had made reference to that. Some of the delays, the first one was related to picking up on Councillor Cushing's previous comment, was related to a system implementation in terms of the uniform system within planning, and that saw poor levels of performance against national targets in Q1 of 2021-22, I think it was, whereas now we are very high performing in that space. And subsequently, there was 3 or 4 outstanding recommendations around Section 106 monitoring and collection and record keeping, and they have been addressed through a module implementation. So this is the last outstanding action from that 2020 report, and is being will be considered about in terms of the capacity of the service. In terms of the following issues, we haven't the civil contingency officer had a long period of absence due to long COVID and has been on a phased return to work, but the level of risk associated with that is not considered to be significant, but hasn't been actioned. In terms of the waste management actions, the members are aware of both the target operating model implementation and more recently industrial action by Serco some Serco employees. That situation is now resolved. The dispute is closed, and the pay offer across the 2 years has been accepted and implemented, including back payments made to Serco staff. We can look at those issues again, but they are as I've reported. And the key control and assurance are more new or more recent actions which you've discussed in terms of the previous issue. We are, following Tina's appointment, we are looking at how the car park contract and enforcement management system works for this authority, in that the contract terms are not clearly stated, and so we need to be satisfied that that contract is working for us. And I've asked Tina to do an options appraisal on that based on the custom and practice that she observes, or the team observe, over this forthcoming summer, so that we are in a position to consider changes to the contract and how it works for us, or whether we need to consider alternative methods moving forward. And in terms of counter fraud and corruption, I think that that's a recent added addition to this list, because the list is dynamic and added to all of the time, and there's a separate agenda item on this agenda that seeks to address and close down that action. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Okay, just for our new members, actually, acronym BCKLWN is Borough of Kings Lynn and West Norfolk. They manage our car park contracts currently, so I just thought that might be helpful. It says on there, start a conversation, but presumably you're doing the two things, maybe a conversation with them about the penalty charge notices, but also reviewing the contract going forward. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And that's, yeah, okay. All right. And that'll obviously be part of all the things that come through to us in the future. Okay, and do we have, let's go back just to the very first one then. That planning service improvement plan, when is that due back into ONS? Do we know? Because that's kind of holding this one up, isn't it? Do you know that, Steve?
I don't know. It's due back to ONS in terms of a periodic report. I don't know if it's September.
Okay.
I don't know if it is, but
No.
I don't think it's imminent. Not like in the next cycle of meetings.
No. But that at least gives us an indication when we may see a change in that status of that. And it's my understanding that it's probably September. Right,
We've got the 30th of September on that one, so I'm not sure what the paper deadline is for our next meeting, but it may be actually that a lot of progress has been made, but you'll still see it on there until such time that we receive the evidence to then, move it off onto the completed tab.
Okay. So sorry, can I ask you, in terms of what Steve was saying, the number that we've had in COVID, are you as our internal auditor confident that we are bringing these down and pulling them in?
I don't think it would be a very good thing for me to say to, stop the momentum. I think we absolutely need to continue on. But there certainly has been a lot of work in this space. The previous audit committee were very good at assisting with that. And I know that the senior leadership team are definitely on board with getting these completed and signed off. So if we all work together, I think some of these older ones will definitely be moved to complete soon.
Yeah. And I've not seen any indication there that there's barriers. It's just stuff that we need to work through. So there's nothing that we need to suggest in there. So thank you. Anybody else? No, good. Right. So is that just a note? Is it that one? Right? Are we finished? 5, 6? Are we just noting that report? Yeah. So. Yes. Yeah. So that's it then. So everybody's happy with that. We'll note that. That's fine. Thank you. Thank you again. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So the second report for you today is the opinion for 22-23. And this is pulled together to summarise all of our work and then provide an opinion on governance, risk management and control for year ending 22-23 for North Norfolk District Council. So we've pulled together all of the work and also look at our performance as a team within this report as well. Towards the back of the report, you've also got some comparison tables to show what the gradings were in each year for the individual areas. So I'll quickly run you through the key points of this report. Section 2.2 on page 61 is the opinion itself. So here we're saying that the overall opinion on the framework is a reasonable, and that is a positive assurance grading. Within the paragraphs contained within 2.2, I've also made reference to those areas that have received a substantial assurance in year, which is very positive for North Norfolk District Council. We then make reference to 2 that received a limited assurance grading. So out of all of the work that we carried out, just 2 areas were given a limited there. And they were for Peer Pavilion. I have to say at this point that whilst a number of recommendations were raised, they are now all implemented apart from 1. So clearly when we're raising these points for management to address, they are completing them quickly and providing us with the evidence that gives us comfort that those risks no longer exist. So that has been factored into the opinion itself. And then the key financial controls report was completed very late in this year, only until up a couple of weeks ago. So I'm not expecting officers to jump on those actions right away, given the resourcing constraints that have occurred. So we've got reasonable timeframes sitting within those action points. And at 3.5 of the report, we would just urge the council to make reference to any outstanding issues that we have raised throughout the year on its control framework. So if I take you to that section, hopefully you will see within the annual governance statement our overview and our areas that we feel should be referenced for this year within that document. So we've provided some paragraphs there about Peer Pavilion and the fact that those are all now mostly resolved. And then we give a summary about key controls and assurance. There is one other recommendation that remains overdue from a limited assurance report in previous years. And again, we would urge the District Council to actually make reference to that until such time that it is complete. Section 5 of this report talks about our performance. So we carry out an internal assessment against the public sector internal audit standards on an annual basis, which gives Tina and all of our other clients comfort that we're delivering the service in accordance with that. Last year, we also had an external independent assessor into our service area to understand our conformance with the public sector internal audit standards. And it was highlighted that our service is being delivered in conformance with those standards. So that's another positive bit of assurance for you as a committee that when we are providing the work to you, it is delivered in line with internationally recognised standards. I've provided Appendix 4, a breakdown of the different standards and how we matched up against that. And if you'd like to see the full report, please do request that from me. I'd be more than happy to circulate it. 5.2 is our performance indicators, and this is what we measure the performance of the contractor tier against. Now, you will probably see those timeliness performance indicators aren't within the boundaries of the performance that we expect for the year 22-23, and we need to work on this with the contractor going forward. Happily, the quality element of it has been fine and within the targets, but the timeliness around issuing memorandums, getting the draft reports out on time certainly needs improvement. So myself and the director and the core team of auditors meet on a weekly basis to try and break down some of those challenges. Hopefully next year we'll see a much improved position on those. Yeah. The section 5.3 is the effectiveness of head of internal audit. It's another kind of checklist that we can compare ourselves against to make sure that we're conforming to best practice. So that has been provided to Tina for her to have a look over. Appendix 1 on page 67 gives you an overview of the number of recs raised and all of the different audits that we've carried out for the year. And similarly with page 68 as well. And then Appendix 2 on page 69 is the assurance chart that I was talking about, where you can, over the last 5 years, compare the gradings given for each of the areas to build up an understanding about whether the control framework is improving or decreasing in each of those areas. And that's it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Fane. Yeah, just Christopher, this is where I was saying earlier that it shows when we're in the meeting earlier, if you'll excuse me, people in it, but we were talking about how it's changed over time if the risk has gone up. Whilst it doesn't give us an arrow, we do have some evidence in Appendix 2 of how those things have gone up or down improved. So we do have some data there. We can review at another time when we think it can be presented differently. But we do have the information. Thank you. Any points anybody wants to raise on this particular report? Steve, thank you.
Thank you. The outstanding action in respect of the Chroma peer audit and the deed of variation identified at 3.5, and the last action on page 54 of the NN 2311 peer pavilion report. The deed of variation is to be signed in person, meeting on the 29th of June, when the managing director of Open Wide Coastal is due to come up for the first night of the peer show on Saturday, the 1st of July.
Thank you for that update, Steve. And anybody else got any questions? No. Let's have a quick look. Try and find my
I think
notes.
the recommendations are a little bit more
Yeah.
substantial on this one.
Yeah, I'm just having a quick look through, excuse me, because I say I'm going digital, just trying to make sure I've got no more notes. For example, one of the things I was presumably, if something hasn't in this, taking this Appendix 2, where there's a line, for example, complaints and freedom of information. I chose that randomly, that may be answerable, but there's no grading on them, and there's some further down where there's absolutely no grading. So could you explain that for me?
That will be where we haven't looked at it in the last 5 years. As you can appreciate, to carry out an audit in every single area is quite a task. So we try to select the areas that represent the most significant risks to the council. We haven't had a strategic risk raised in that area for that period. However, we do have one scheduled for this financial year. So you will receive assurance on that this year.
Okay, thank you. For that particular one. So the others are only if we identify there may be a risk, then you'll go along and give us assurances. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Right, so let's get to the recommendations for that one. I'll make sure that we 8. So the recommendations: to receive and consider the contents of the annual report and opinion of the head of internal audit. Note that the reasonable audit option has been given in relation to the framework. Note that the opinions expressed together with significant matters arising from the report contained in this report should be given due consideration when doing our annual government statement, and note the conclusions of the review. Are we all content with that? No comments from anybody? So do we need a proposal second? No, it's just a note again. Thank you. Thank you. Right, so no 9 because we've done that. So we're on to the Cara show now. So Jordan, are we? Corporate risk. All right, so that is with who's Tina. Thank you. Sorry, Tina. Apologies. Yeah. Item 10, corporate risk register. Yeah. Oh yeah.
This is the corporate risk register that I believe you've all seen before. We have the overview on page 84, which shows where each of the strategic risks is sitting at the moment, following the recent review of all of the risks, and the rest of the document goes into detail about the operational risks underneath those strategic risks and where we sit. All service managers have contributed to updating this, and we are making progress in terms of some of the ones that have, I know personally for myself that I have improved or reduced some of the risk in some of the areas, in my view, and that you'll see from the graphs and charts whether there's been any increase or decrease in the perceived risk at this point in time.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. And apologies again for missing out. See you. Any comments from anybody at all on the risk register? Do you indicate it's all No, no, it's fine. Christopher, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We sort of discussed this a little bit this morning in our training session, so something I would like to bring up, and that's the format of the report. I certainly don't find this very helpful at all. If I was asked the question, do I understand, having read this, what the principal risks are facing this council, the answer is actually I don't. And that's based on the format. And as we mentioned, to reiterate for those who weren't at our training session this morning, if you're looking at risk, it's something that might happen, which will have an adverse impact. And then you list what the mitigation actions are against that particular risk. This format doesn't do that. We've got some very high level risks. It doesn't really state what any of the impacts of those will be in all instances. Then we just get lists of reports and things which are presumably meant to be the mitigating actions, but I don't know how they actually relate necessarily to the risk. I think it would be far easier for us as a committee to understand what the risks were if we adopted a more formal risk approach, and perhaps it's something we might be able to, if others are willing to investigate that, perhaps we could look to work with Faye and others to see what that could be, and Tina.
Yeah, so that I understand. So basically we're looking something that's more chart-like, just a very straightforward, spreadsheet type thing that just says, here's the risk, here's what we're going to do about it, just laying it out more simply. So whilst this is good and there's lots of information, actually simplification would be better for us. I think that's okay. So I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
We are actually in the process of looking at the software that we're currently using for this and going through perhaps a tendering exercise to replace it over the summer / autumn. So there will be some changes, but we are also discussing, as you suggest, the use of a spreadsheet. This system is in phase, and it also holds up performance management information. And I think there's quite a few of us that would agree that it's not presented in the best way possible. And we'll be looking to simplify it and make it a bit more easy to understand going forwards.
Thank you. Just go.
Thank you, Jen. Just to add, we've put some time aside this year to work with Tina and team, haven't we, on risk management and a bit of advisory work around that. We've got a good set of comparison data across the consortium, what works well and what doesn't work so well, so we can feed that in.
Okay, thank you. And Officer Thomas, thank you, Helen.
Yeah, in addition to that, we are scheduled to review the whole of the performance management, the risk management framework this summer. What's in the system reflects the current risk management framework. So the system will do whatever we want it to do. So what needs to be done if the risk management framework, as we have set out at the moment, is not fulfilling our needs, is to change the framework and get the new system to support that new framework.
Okay, so I think we all agree that there needs changes and that we need to see what comes forward, because it needs to work within the wider context of the council as well, because people have got used to this system. We need to make sure that it engages that. Yeah, Christopher.
If I may, I mean, I take your point. I mean, there are a number of stakeholders in that, but I would suggest we are one of those key stakeholders. So I think we ought to be involved in that review, discussion and debate if we could.
Thank you. So is that part of that will be part of the process?
Yeah, we've just carried out a similar exercise for South Norfolk and Broadland. We engaged the audit committee as part of the work to say, what is it that you need in terms of the assurance? What do you want the risk register to look like? So we had some really good discussions around the table just to, figure out what it is that we need from these documents, and they will ultimately evolve over time, of course, but getting, a few ideas down from the off, I think has been quite useful.
Okay, thank you.
And also to add,
go.
Officer Thomas.
Yeah.
I understand that approval of that framework will be from this committee.
Okay.
So you will be very definitely involved in that process.
That's good to hear. Thank you for that assurance. Thank you. Okay. Is that everybody with that? So are we a note on this one?
About updating that risk management framework or biggest action rather than.
Okay, we don't need to vote on that just now. Thank you. Okay, thanks. All right, good. Thank you. So we're now on to counter fraud, corruption and bribery. Is this the one? I just need to make sure. Yeah, this is the one that's got the appendix in it, hasn't it? So yeah, can I just remind everybody again that this has got an appendix on the pink papers, so we shouldn't refer to any details of what's there. If we need to, then we'll have to go into private session. Thank you. So I think it's for you now. Did I get it right this time? Thank you.
Thank you. Members, this report essentially comes out of an internal audit of last year, a counter fraud internal audit, which required as one of the recommendations an update and action plans in regard to counter fraud activity. There has been some agreement that this can, at least in part, be done by way of the update in the annual monitoring officer report. However, having a look at that previous internal audit, which received a limited assurance, which I think was in line with other councils in the consortium, there were a number of recommendations that were made, implemented or for ongoing review. And so as part of this update and report, I've conducted a more detailed look at what this council is doing to address fraud risk. So one of the things that was mentioned in that earlier internal audit was the risk of the council not having any dedicated fraud officer or fraud officers. That was looked at the time by senior officers and shared with members that it was not considered to be cost effective in regards to the low level of risk here, but was agreed that it would be kept under review rather than never. So part of this report looks at that. There was also a recommendation in regards to counter fraud training and awareness for officers to update members. That is now in place via Skillgate. It's a mandatory course and is being monitored to make sure that all officers do undertake that training. But we've gone beyond that so that it is also available to all members. So in order to have a look at the issues that were raised in that audit and to give members an update, one of the things that was mentioned in that original audit was a document which I've referred to in the papers, which is Fighting Fraud and Corruption Locally. And it's a key document for local authorities to consider what they are doing and how they can address risk of fraud in their organisation. And that document that was mentioned in the audit, I've looked at that and have considered the checklist at the end of that document. And you'll see that on page 111 of your papers, Appendix A. So my first consideration was looking at that checklist, liaising with those key stakeholders and noting, so having a look at the checklist requirement and noting what this council is doing in response to that requirement. And then you'll see a column at the end, which if the word yes is written in, that means that it's considered at a later action plan, and because it's considered, it needs further consideration. So for example, actually this is one that has now been addressed. If you look at page 112, one of the questions on the checklist requirement is there a portfolio holder who has fraud within their remit? Well, at the time of writing this report, there wasn't, but it was noted that there's a portfolio holder for finance, but it has been confirmed that it is Councillor Shires who I've been liaising with in regards to this. So that's the checklist, which members may have some questions on. Following that, there is on page 123 was a fraud risk assessment, which was completed by the previous section 151 officer that I have looked at in regard to this review and update. Then on page 133 is a general corporate counter fraud awareness action plan, which has also been taken into account. On page, just going back a little bit in regard to the checklist, revised action plan is at page 121, and that's where it addresses what may be done to mitigate those risks or the actions that have been identified in the checklist. And then finally, and I'll refer to it very generally, in Appendix E, Roman numeral 1 on page 135, I've contacted the key officers. So having a look at that earlier assessment where the areas of risk were identified, the risk areas, I've looked at those risk areas, contacted those key officers to see if they've had any incidences of fraud or any breaches that could place the council at risk of fraud, and asked them what they are doing in addition to that previous assessment to mitigate those risks going forward. So as mentioned, this report is essentially for note, but as you'll see on the checklist, you are a key stakeholder in the fight against fraud. So this report and this checklist is brought to you, and you may wish to further review the checklist, ask some questions, or consider the risk and mitigation measures.
Thank you, Cara. I mean, clearly there's been considerable work gone on there to bring this forward. So thank you for that and for everybody involved. I think it's good to see the Appendix E shows that we are identifying potential things, and therefore that it's working. I don't know if the committee have any comments on any particular bits they wish to make. Christopher, thank you.
So thank you, Cara. That is an excellent piece of work. Quick question, if I may, on the training. You said training is being done. Is that sort of once and done training for people, or is that something they have expected to do on an annual basis?
Well, at the moment, it is a one-off piece of training, but we, as with all aspects of counter fraud, it's always subject to review. And again, next year, I will look at the position. It's a training module that will stay on our skill gate. In addition to that council-wide training, there's also specific training in regard to some of those officers who work in key areas such as council tax and revenues, where fraud is potentially more likely. So they undertake some more specialised training in addition.
So thank you. Things that I mentioned as well, I think in this report here, but basically, you know, fraud evolves. Presumably if we become aware that there's a new way of being fraudulent actions being taken, we alert key people, do we, that that's a possibility if we're not, you know, change, continue updating on training. I can see. Thank you.
Yes, that is correct. I think I've got something in particular at the end of one of my documents.
I think I've read something there, and I just wanted to be sure that we notified people that if we become aware.
Yes, page 122 in particular of Appendix B.
Okay.
Not only in regards to fraud, but incidences which may breach the procedures that are capable of someone making fraudulent activity. It needs to be reported to either the section 151 officer or myself.
Okay, thank you. Officer Black, Steve, thank you.
Thank you. So I wish to advise that corporate leadership team have discussed this paper with Cara in her capacity as monitoring officer. This is an action that we said we would review in respect of a audit report undertaken across the audit consortium 12 months ago. I don't believe, challenged Mrs. Hayward about many audit judgments that the authority has received in recent times, but I did have concerns around some of the conclusions that existed in that audit report 12 months ago as they related to North Norfolk, because as I say, it was a consortium-wide report, and I felt that some of the conclusions and risks were not significant in the context of North Norfolk. There was a recommendation made that the authority should consider appointing a fraud officer or officers, and I'm concerned at the cost shunting that would involve, because this authority, going back 7 or 8 years, did have a fraud team of 3 staff. Those staff were tupied to the DWP and worked within the Department of Work and Pensions, because it was felt that the risk attached with fraud was most likely in benefit services, and that those responsibilities moved to that organisation. So for us to then be asked to re-establish a fraud officer resource, 1 or 2 officers, would have been a direct cost that had to be borne through your budget directly by North Norfolk Council taxpayers. So we discussed that as a corporate leadership team 15 months ago, and Mrs. Hayward was comfortable with the fact that we said we would assess the risks further and consider those, and we have revisited that issue 12 months on, and this is the action plan that Mrs. Jordan has presented to us and CLT fully endorse. We don't believe, with our high levels of council tax and business rate recovery, that we have a particular issue of fraud or risk in there. We have good rates of collection and recovery. We have measures within our HR systems and processes where checks and balances clearly exist in terms of expenses, fraud, and those sort of things. And we have a good record of scrutinising people's qualifications and that sort of thing in terms of employment. So the document has been given very detailed consideration. But as you rightly say, Chair, fraud and the approaches to fraud will evolve over time, and it's right that we look at this on an annual basis. But on the basis of this action plan, there wasn't a feeling compared to some other authorities that the risk and loss or potential loss from fraud would justify the provision of a dedicated officer, and that because that responsibility would sit then with one person. We've taken a more distributive approach, particularly looking at training, but additional level training in those high areas of risk around benefit and revenues administration.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I mean, having a fraud officer in itself is open to fraud, isn't it? You know, by having it in a wider arena, as you put it, then there's more chance for whistleblowing across. I think, you know, there's more people looking at it. So having not been involved with the earlier and obviously the recommendations, I would be inclined to agree with that output, but I don't know if the committee has anything to add. I think we've come to a good balanced decision there. Does that satisfy the need for closing it down in terms of internal audit?
I think it's very encouraging to hear that whilst there might not be a resource, somebody's taking the lead on checking best practice against a framework that's recognised. Having an annual report allows GRAC to be kept informed of any activity and whether there are any trends increasing over that time. So yes, certainly it's not for me to make decisions about resources, and the beauty of internal audit is that we make a recommendation, but actually it's in the gift of the leaders to say, no, we're satisfied with taking that risk on. But yeah, I think I'm definitely content to sign off the recommendation on the basis of the work that's being done by Cara. It's obviously very, very thorough.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, so I'm good. That's great. I think any further comments? No, I think we've landed in a good place there. Thank you, Cara. It's great. A bit of work. So the recommendations are to note the update reports, to review and note the checklist, to review and note the action plan, to note the fraud assessment update, which includes incidences of potential fraud. Are we all content with that, to note that? Yes, thank you. That's all done that. Thank you. So, update and action plan. That's what we just did, wasn't it? No, there we go. Yes. No, exemptions register. Yeah, thank you. It's getting there. So, there's you again. Thank you, Cara. So, Officer John, thank you.
Thank you.
This chair's going to get me one day.
I report to the GRAC committee the exemptions on a follow-on period. So the previous period, there were 2 exemptions that I reported to committee, and the follow-on date. So for the period between the 9th of February this year to the 25th of May this year, there were 2 exemptions, and I've noted those down on page 139.
We've seen those, and any comments from anybody? No, all happy. Is that just noted again? Was just reported to us. Thank you. Okay, so that was 12, 13 governance risk and audit committee outcomes and action list. So
yeah,
thank you,
so
Matt.
just to note there, I think most of the actions are up to date. There was reference made to the previous meeting in the minutes, there, item 79, the statement of accounts update for 21-22, which was suggested to be brought back to this meeting, but we've had an update from the section 151 officer, and I think, was I right in hearing that it's supposed to be signed off at the end of this week? Is that correct, Tina? For the 21-22 accounts?
Not signed off. We're working with the auditor we should complete them, and then they'll need to
Come to the next.
be the chair himself that will
Right.
sign off, but it will be following that, yeah.
Okay.
Completion, so.
That's everything from the update and action list, but I'm happy to move on to the work program if you like. Yeah. So just to note there, the first item on the June work program was the external audit plan for 21-22. I did make contact with EY, our external auditors, when preparing this draft work program, and asked them where they were with preparing that. They essentially said to me that until we've signed off the previous year's audit, they can't start work on the 21-22. So again, that hands back to getting that process of accounts completed. I do wonder, I note that we have always had a meeting, or a possible meeting scheduled in July for the annual account sign off. Tina, I don't know if the 18th of July is something that is achievable, or if it's more likely to be September, but just something to consider there. And I also note we will be getting, I think we'd usually take the AGS annual governance statement, local code of corporate governance in June. That has moved to September. So just to note that. And then also in September, you'll see, again, we've got some external audit items listed there. Again, that will depend on the completion of the previous year, essentially.
Which year would you be wanting to sign off at the July meeting? Because we've got delegated authority for the chair to sign off the 2021. The audit of the 21-22 accounts would be in August. It might be possible, they say that it could be brought forward so that they wouldn't be ready for that July meeting. So I don't think we'd actually have any to sign off in July.
The only thing I want to check with the delegated authority, I'd have to look back at the minutes, was that I believe that delegated authority may have been given to the previous chair, but I would check with the monitoring officer or democratic service officer whether that delegated authority would carry over to the new chair.
I think I need to see the wording.
Yeah.
Could I just add there for committee's information that the external auditor did raise that with me in terms of I would need to check whether it was still possible for the chair to sign.
Yeah, so we can look into that and get an answer via email.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah, so in terms of that was for the 2021 accounts. And then, of course, once they're done, then as I said, work can begin with external audit on the 21-22 accounts. Yeah, we will, I think, Tina, you said that they would start in August. That was correct. Yeah.
So, thank you, Matt. So I think obviously we spoke earlier, and there's a plan to bring us a chart so that we can understand where we are with each of these, which will make that easier to understand. Any questions from anybody with the work programme? Are we all content with that? I know it's getting a bit bottled up in September, but I think hopefully we can work forward and work through as Officer Stanley works through stuff to get us back on track, to get a much better rhythm. Okay, so I think that's the last item, is it?
Yeah, I did just recall, I think prior to the election, we did have some more planned policies or policy updates coming from the civil contingencies manager. I think they were put on hold. I think it was mentioned previously in a meeting that there was a period of long-term sickness there with long COVID. I will chase up with that and see where we are, but we may see some more civil contingencies report prior to the kind of annual report that we receive in December. So we may see these appear on the work programme at some point.
Okay, well, while you're doing that, just pass on our best wishes. Hope recovers. Thank you. So I think that's everything. If somebody's got anything else to rise, I just thank everybody for your fortitude today. It's been a warm day, and we've taken a bit longer perhaps than we normally would. I know normally about an hour, but I thank you for that. And so we'll close the meeting. Was that about 4 minutes past 4? Thank you very much, everybody.